Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our Supporting Black Undocumented Students Through Higher Education webinar. So glad that folks are joining us. I believe we have folks from all over the country actually signed up for this webinar. So I'm really glad everyone's taking part of this really important presentation and conversation, hopefully, that we'll have today. As folks are jumping on, I also encourage everyone to introduce yourself in the chat. I know in webinar, we don't get to really interact as much, but if you'd like to introduce yourself with just your name, your pronouns, and the organization, if any, or campus that you're representing here today. My name is Madeline Villanueva, and I am the Catalyst Fund Specialist with Immigrants Rising, and I'm really grateful to have worked with our two amazing speakers who's gonna get a chance to introduce themselves later today to put together this very important resource to support Black undocumented students in higher education, as well as this webinar to just launch that today. So thank you for all of those who's just introducing themselves. Welcome, welcome. And we are also live streaming this on Facebook. So if anybody is watching on the Facebook side, thank you for joining us today too. And so I'll just have us go to the next slide. And again, as I mentioned, this webinar is being hosted by Immigrants Rising for folks who has joined space with us with Immigrants Rising before. Welcome back. And for folks who are joining us for the first time, thank you for coming. Just a little bit about our organization. We are a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco that works to empower undocumented people now. I know that was a change that was recently made with our mission statement. Undocumented people to achieve educational and career goals through personal, institutional, and policy transformation. And I mainly work as the Catalyst Fund Specialist. I do work with educators from across the state of California to ensure that undocumented student support services are accessible and strengthened and available for all undocumented students, right? And so I'll have us go to our next slide again. And before we kind of dive deeper into the webinar today, I also do want to take some time to kind of recognize the lands that myself and our speakers today are occupying. So I do want to acknowledge the Achieng, sorry about that, Achieng, Kouassi, and Chumash tribes. They are the indigenous folks of the land that myself and our speakers are in, and I do want to pay respects to their people and their elders, both past and present, and kind of think about the history of displacement in our country and how that really affects kind of like why the work that Immigrants Rising, for example, takes part in, and the work that folks here I know also take part in. And I also do invite folks to also think about and acknowledge the land that they're occupying today. You can actually find that out through this website right here. And I'll just have us maybe sit in a moment for a little bit to do that too. Great. Thank you for doing that with me too. And thank you all for folks who are also continuing to introduce themselves in the chat. And so I'll have us go to the next slide, where I'll be introducing our amazing resource authors and presenters for today. I've had the opportunity, as I mentioned, to work with these two amazing folks as part of our higher education program at Immigrants Rising. But I do want to introduce, and please give them a warm welcome in the chat, Eva-Vera Burns, who is also an organizer with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, and Shirleen and Achieng, who's an organizer for the Haitian Bridge Alliance, who, in addition to doing this very important resource for us today, has also done years of advocacy in undocumented and Black immigrant spaces as well. And so I'm gonna pass the mic over to them to introduce themselves and start our presentation for you all.
Thank you, Madeleine. So again, my name is Eva-Vera. I just go by Eva. I I've been working in the immigrant rights sphere for about almost 2 years now. And it's been an amazing experience. I'm a current organizer with BAJI, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And I am also a student pursuing my master's degree. And I will pass it to Shirleen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shirleen Achieng, pronouns she, her. I have been advocating on behalf of undocumented immigrants for the past 6 years now. And that advocacy really began in college. I graduated class of 2020 from UC Irvine. And throughout my college experience, I advocated on behalf of undocumented immigrants. So a lot of that informs the guide as well. And currently I serve as an organizer for the Haitian Bridge Alliance, and that entails coordinating campaigns that highlight the plight of Black immigrants, as well as running and coordinating the Black Immigrants Bail Fund, which helps Black immigrants who are stuck in detention to pay for their bond so that they can be released. And I'm excited to have you with us today. Please listen, pay attention, and take action after today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirleen. So I think we can now dive into our presentation. Next slide will be showing us the theme of this webinar is supporting Black undocumented students through higher education. So our goals for the webinars, our goal for the educator guide is to raise awareness among staff, faculty, and administrators on how to create access and opportunities for Black undocumented students. So we want to increase the understanding of the experience of the Black undocumented community and students in higher education. We also want people to learn how to better reach to Black undocumented students and uplift their narrative. We want to provide tangible strategies and practices to build communities and trust with Black undocumented students. And so we will be doing so by giving effective strategies and practices that educators, staff, faculty members can use. And finally, we want to learn steps for using the resource guide to strengthen outreach and engagement with Black undocumented students on their campus or organizations. So we will now go to the next slide. And I will ask you all to go to menti.com for a quick poll. Enter the code that you see on the screen. It's 42519952. So go to menti.com, enter the code 42519952, and answer the following question. What do you know about Black undocumented students? And I think Nancy will help me share the answers that everybody is providing. So the question again is, what do you know about Black undocumented students? And for people that weren't able to go to the website, you go to menti.com, menti.com, enter the code 42519952, and answer, what do you know about Black undocumented students? So I already see an answer, not very much. They are eligible for CDA. Did you mean DACA? They are underrepresented. That's very true. And that's something that came up during our focus groups. Very little. Yes, they're not little. There are a lot of undocumented Black people out there, but there's the fear of stigmatization that is on them, and that makes them hide from who they are and from looking for resources, I love seeing those answers. So I see lack of resources, many languages, rare at my school, okay, not current knowledge. So the theme that comes up from this is that there is underrepresentation, lack of resources, and no visibility. So lack of knowledge about undocumented Black students. So thank you for sharing. We will now go back to the slides and we will address some of the answers that you provided in the Menti.com. So next slide, please. And for that, we will talk a little bit about the background of the Black undocumented population, but also Black undocumented students in the US. Next slide. So there is approximately 10.5 million of undocumented people in the US. And out of that number, there is 16% of Black people. So that 16% is an estimated 575,000 Black immigrants who are living in the US without work authorization. And that data was retrieved from the Pew Research Center article in 2017. Next slide. Here we have the top birth regions of Black immigrants. The first one is the Caribbean, with 46% of Black immigrants. And out of that 46%, 16% of them are undocumented. The second birth region is Africa, with 42% of Black immigrants and 13% of undocumented Black immigrants in that number. And finally, we have the Caribbean. We have Central and South America, sorry, with 12% of Black immigrants. We don't have the exact data for the undocumented population in that group, but there certainly are undocumented people also there coming from Central and South America. Next, we will go into DACA, which stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And so as we saw in the previous slide, we have 3 top birth regions of Black immigrants. And from those regions, the countries that have the higher rates of DACA approvals are Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Nigeria. It's important to note that the DACA approval rate for Black immigrants is 87%, so lower than other groups of immigrants that has an approval rate of 91% when it comes to DACA. Also, there is only 2% of Caribbean immigrants that are DACA eligible, even though it's the top birth region of Black immigrants. And same thing for Africa, there's only 3% of African immigrants that are DACA eligible. And we got this data from the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, set of Black migrants. So in the next slide, we will go over the stats of Black undocumented students. And there is an estimate of 2,600 Black undocumented students that graduate high school every year. Next, please. Thank you. And so out of that number, about 400,000 undocumented students were enrolled in college in 2019. And out of that group, only 12% of them identified as Black. But also when we go into the table and we look at it, we see that there is only 5.3% of those students who are DACA eligible. and it's one of the lowest rates after the Hispanic undocumented student and the API undocumented student, also the white undocumented students. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, I'm going to share with you all the experiences of Black undocumented students. And those experiences were shared by Black undocumented students that were part of some focus groups that we conducted, and they shared their difficulties, they shared what they needed from educators, staff members, to be supported and graduate from college and just have a successful college life in general. So next slide, please. So the first big theme was around being undocumented and Black, and participants shared that being an undocumented Black student limited their access to scholarships, education, and resources like DACA, jobs, and fellowships. So not all undocumented Black students are DACA eligible. So a lot of them don't have the work permit, they can't work. And so when they can't work, it's hard for them to have the financial means to pay for their educations. And even when they try to find scholarships, look up for scholarships, there are not a lot of private scholarships out there that are available to non-US citizens and non-resident, no people without any permanent residency. So that just makes their situation harder, and it's often hard for them to continue with school and deal with also the criminalization that they're facing, with the fear of being deported, and all of that also affect their mental health. Participants also shared that they feel the pressure to work much harder in order to access resources that other students get with much less effort. And with that statement was shared among almost all our participants. And here we have a testimony that I'm gonna read that was from one of the undocumented Black students we've interviewed. So she said, "I always knew that I was undocumented since the age of 6. My parents thought that the only way for me to go to college and get a scholarship was to be really good in extracurricular activities, such as sport and music. They thought I would get a scholarship based on that, and that it was my only option to pay for college. However, I started building up anxiety because of the pressure that my parents were constantly putting on me." And that student went to California State University. And so that pressure led to her having depression. That's something that she shared later on during the focus group. So the problem is not only in the schools, but it also transfers into the personal lives of the Black undocumented students. Next slide, please. Now, the second part that was discussed during our focus groups were ways to navigate higher education. So participants noted that educators, counselors, and other staff members at their institution had little to no knowledge regarding the resources available to undocumented students, DACA and AB 540 students. So they were not helpful in navigating Black undocumented students through college. And there's actually one student that shared with us that she heard about AB 540 when she was sitting in the bus, and she overheard people talking about it. So if it wasn't for that situation, she would have never received access to those resources because the educators that she approached didn't know much about it. And that's something that we are trying to change. The next thing is that some students had access to undocumented student service where they learn about resources such as AB 540, but they did not feel welcome in the spaces, in the dream centers or the undocumented student programs due to the lack of inclusivity and representation of Black students. So a little example is that sometimes when you walk into one of the programs directed to undocumented students, we see a lot of representation from other races and predominantly the Latinx community, but there is little to no representation of Black people. So when the students enter those spaces, even though they have resources there for them, they don't feel like they are at their place. They don't feel like it's a place for them. The pamphlet are not showing their Black students, so it can be misleading to them, and it can sometimes make them feel that this is not a place for me. I don't feel comfortable here. So there is a need for representation. There is a need for Black role model, Black resources, Black educators that can guide them through the process and that can understand their difficulty of being undocumented and of being an undocumented student, and also sharing that on the Black identity with that. So that's an issue that was brought up by all the students. And even from my own experience, when I was going to my undergrad university, I used to go to the USP program, but I knew that there were resources there, but at the same time, there wasn't that representation of Black students. Even though the people were welcoming and all of that, but I didn't see that representation. So for me, it didn't cause much of a problem, but for other students, it does. And that's important to note that we are all different. We all deal with situations differently. And it's important to add that piece of inclusivity for everybody to feel welcome. So one testimony that we have here from one of our students is that it is important to have a role model that looks like me and that can understand the battles that I have based on my identity. Unfortunately, the Dream Resource Centers do not provide that element of representation. And that's from an undocumented Black student from Cal State University. So with that, I'm gonna move on and let the space to Shirleen to talk a little bit about the educator experiences. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our educator focus group findings, and just noting that we also did educator focus groups, and we targeted educators who work with undocumented student services, as well as educators who work with Black students, to better gauge their own experiences and interactions with Black undocumented students. Next slide. So when it comes to knowledge and undocumented issues, of all the educators interviewed, almost all of them noted that undocumented student services on their respective campuses did not target Black undocumented students. And this is really important to note because even the educators who are not affiliated with undocumented student services were aware that there was a space on campus or resources on campus for undocumented students, but they didn't know that they did not see the outreach specifically targeting Black undocumented students. So that's something important to note. Next slide. When it comes to perception of Black undocumented students, educators noted the lack of media awareness regarding this population in the mainstream immigration movement, which creates invisibility on campuses. And this is, again, really important to acknowledge because, again, Black undocumented immigrants are very underrepresented when it comes to the mainstream immigration movement. So like Eva mentioned, there's around 600,000 of us out of the 10.5 million undocumented immigrants. And the interesting thing is that we are twice as likely to be detained and deported. So we overrepresent the detention spaces and incarceration rates in immigrant prisons, but we're not represented when it comes to the mainstream media and the faces that you're seeing. And so that creates this illusion that we're not even in these spaces. And also in terms of difference in experiences between non-Black undocumented students and Black undocumented students, educators across the board highlight a unique sense of isolation among Black undocumented students due to their Blackness. And this is really important to acknowledge because, again, that double criminalization that Black undocumented immigrants in general face, so you're already criminalized because of your Blackness. As we know in this country, Blackness is something that's targeted by the state simply for existing. You could just get killed for being Black. And then at the same time, there's another policing of your own identity that you're doing on yourself because you understand the ramifications that come with you disclosing your status and the likelihood of you getting deported. And so that creates a unique sense of isolation. And that is interesting that even educators noted that because, like Eva mentioned, you maybe find students want to access resources, but they're not really engaging with the spaces. And then also the policing of Black students by campus police is another unique disparity educators noted that would have negative consequences for Black undocumented students due to the double criminalization they experience. And again, this is really important because as I mentioned, even though we don't look undocumented, quote unquote, because of our Blackness, we have a hyperinvisibility that is experienced. And so we're again more likely to be detained and deported, even though we make up the smallest population in the undocumented community. And so really thinking about how campus police and really having campus presence of police can be very detrimental to Black undocumented students. Next slide. So when it comes to experiences with Black undocumented students, educators note, again, hyperinvisibility. So even within Black spaces, educators note that Black undocumented students often opt out of disclosing their status to their colleagues. Similarly, within undocumented spaces, some would take advantage of the available resources, but do not engage in the physical space or participate in social events. So again, that hyper-isolation comes from the fact that you know the risk associated with disclosing. And so when you're in undocumented spaces, like Eva mentioned before, you don't even have the representation and visibility, so you don't feel welcome. And in Black spaces, you may engage with the events and programming and even the Black student organizations, but they don't know, your peers don't know about that part of your identity because you just don't know how they're gonna react. That space has not been created for you. And so really thinking about there's a hyper invisibility, which is oxymoronic because we are the smallest population in the undocumented community, yet we're hyper invisibilized because our Blackness makes us stick out. But at the same time, that is the same thing that is making us not being viewed as undocumented, which is really interesting. And then also Black educators who had experiences with Black undocumented students noted that shared racial and cultural backgrounds make the students comfortable disclosing the immigration status to them. So like Eva mentioned previously, undocumented students tend to gravitate more towards, their Black educators and peers and disclosing that information towards them. So it's really important to think about how can we even create those spaces in Black student services, because undocumented Black issues is not strictly and solely for undocumented resource centers to deal with. This is also an issue for Black resource centers. They also need to be addressing that intersectionality as well. A key point made by one of the educators was that out of all the undocumented demographics she served, the Black students have more often expressed the desire to self-deport. This is attributed to anti-Blackness and the fact that most Black undocumented students are non-DACA, which inhibits access to work and other opportunities. And this was such an interesting revelation to learn because I was one of the students this educator worked with, and I did always express a desire to self-deport if post-grad I didn't figure out a way to survive and navigate life. And I think really the big stressor also is anti-Blackness. And that is something that cannot be taken away from our experiences because your Blackness is something that they automatically see first before your immigration identity, before your womanhood, and really just thinking about how this country treats Black people. And then on top of that, you don't have DACA, and that inhibits your access to professional development opportunities. And so that makes it even harder for Black undocumented students to cope with that reality. Next slide. So now we're going to get into some of the best practices. And again, this is informed by our focus group findings from both with Black undocumented students as well as educators who worked with Black undocumented students. And so next slide. So the first one is meeting financial need. And the first bullet point is hiring competent financial aid workers who are conscious of racial bias. This is really important because, like Eva mentioned, there was a student who found out that they were eligible for AB 540 because they just happened to be on a bus ride where it was mentioned. But really thinking about how many even campuses have somebody designated to help undocumented students strictly with their financial aid, because we don't go through FAFSA. If you're in California, you apply for the California Dream Act. And so even thinking about, since undocumented, there's no undocumented Black look. And so you don't even know who you could be encountering who is a Black student who may be undocumented. And this is why it's important for even financial aid workers to not have racial biases when they're engaging with undocumented Black students by making the assumption that, we don't even have undocumented Black students in this space, so why would I be outreaching to them? So that's really important. The second one is promoting fellowship opportunities off campus. And again, it's really important, like Eva mentioned, how majority of Black undocumented students are non-DACA. So that means they need professional development opportunities, but ones that are paid as well, because the financial aspect is important. And so if your campuses specifically don't even have any type of professional development opportunities, then it's your responsibility to make sure that you're looking at what's available off campus and advertising that to students. Additionally, creating professional development opportunities for Black undocumented students on campus by creating fellowships that are inclusive of people without DACA. And again, that's the difference between internship and fellowship, because fellowship, you don't have to go through payroll. It's more lax, and you can get paid through stipends. And so you could literally create a professional development opportunity where a student gets paid, every quarter or every semester through their financial aid, and they get, that amount of payment while also getting professional development opportunities. And then also making sure that you're establishing specific scholarships and fellowships strictly safe for Black undocumented students is important. Because again, a lot of the students we talked to said when there are actual undocumented student scholarships available, they tend to be exclusive to the Latinx population. They're not really targeting us. So even then, when you think you just found something for yourself, it's still even more exclusive. And so thinking about how are ways that we can not only create fellowships that are inclusive of students without DACA, but also targeting Black undocumented students who don't have DACA, so they're applying for these positions. It's one thing to create a resource, but you're also needing to make sure that you're targeting the most marginalized people within that community to access those resources. Also, developing fellowship opportunities for non-DACA graduate students. This is really important because, again, as a non-DACA student, what does graduate school look like for me? Because graduate school, especially if it's a PhD program, they do teaching assistantships, which is TAs. And so if I can get paid through TA-ships, then how else would I be able to fund my 6 or 5 year program, or even master's program? And so having campuses make sure that they have some sort of discretionary funds set aside, because again, funding for undocumented students cannot come from federal funds. It has to be either state or discretionary funds. So making sure this funding is set aside so that when they do actually want to pursue graduate studies, they're able to do that without having to worry about not participating in TA-ships and not being able to get paid for their program. Next slide. And the second bullet point I want to address is building social connection on campus. Now, what does this look like? So centering Black undocumented experiencing during any decision-making of Black or undocumented student services is important. So when it comes to undocumented student services, and again, we understand that all campuses even have a Dream Center or undocumented student center. So whatever that looks like, if it's undocumented student programs, and even for Black resource centers, there was actually more campuses within California when we were doing research with this that had Dream Centers than they had Black resource centers. And I think that's also another conversation about anti-Blackness that can be unpacked in a different webinar. But I think that also can be a hindrance between bridging those two communities and really addressing that intersectionality. So whatever it is that exists on your campus that resembles Black resource services and undocumented resource services, making sure that they are, anytime they're making decisions that involve students, centering the Black undocumented experience. Also highlighting the Black undocumented experience in physical spaces and social media. So not only Eva mentioned, having artwork that is resembling, strictly like the Latinx experience. I think something a student mentioned is how, the artwork that they had in the undocumented spaces had a lot of like migrations through the border imagery, and not everyone also has that experience coming to the United States. So what are ways that you can just diversify your imagery, not only in the undocumented spaces, but also in the Black spaces, and as well through social media? Because again, this is another way if students are not coming to the physical spaces and using these resources, they can at least see through social media that you're posting Black immigrant organization, you're posting Black undocumented leaders and the work that they're doing, and they'll know that you're signaling towards their community. Acting as a bridge for Black undocumented students to connect with each other. This is really important, and this is something one of the educators mentioned, that one of the favorite things to do is connecting an undocumented student with another undocumented student, of course with their consent, because again, disclosing somebody's status without their consent is not okay. But this is a great way, because especially with that unique sense of isolation, how can we make sure that they have somebody else who looks like them and understands that experience to help them get through their college journey? Building cross-departmental relationships in order to highlight the experiences of Black undocumented students. So again, this goes back to the point of how can undocumented student services and Black student services work together, because this is not only a responsibility for undocumented student services, and I want to make that very clear, that also Black student services need to also be intentional and participate in highlighting that Black undocumented intersection that goes very much underseen. Pushing for undocumented student services across the state to host annual conferences that addresses race. And this just goes back to the idea of, the fact that we are anti-Black, we all participate in anti-Blackness, especially educational institutions tend to be very anti-Black with how they deal with Black students. And so especially in undocumented spaces, how are non-undocumented Black people engaging with, anti-Blackness and their understanding of race? And why are they not talking more about, why are we not seeing Black people in our spaces, even though that they exist? And this is something that can be pushed by, undocumented services across the state within California. And of course, that looks different in different states depending on capacity, but I think this is something that is very important, because that is not something that's talked enough within the undocumented community. Also, destigmatizing the Black undocumented experience by highlighting this intersection will create ease. So the goal is that centering, Black undocumented experiences by doing, an event per quarter or an event per semester that highlights that specific intersection, and doing cross-departmental relationships and connecting Black undocumented students to each other. The goal is that eventually they will be comfortable because they see that their identity is normalized, and that will actually allow them to now partake in social connection on campus. Next slide. And then we also need accountability from educators and administrators. This is really important. So educating administrators and professional staff members about the issues faced by Black undocumented students. And again, I don't think this is just a responsibility of undocumented student services and the Black Resource Center. If you're an educator and you work with students in general, you could encounter Black undocumented students. And so it's your responsibility to seek that knowledge by going through ally trainings. If your undocumented space has those on your campus, and if they have nothing, if they have no events that are targeting Black undocumented students, then it's your responsibility to follow Black immigrant organizations and go to their events and learn more about what is happening with Black migrants, and also urging your campus to create events that center that demographic if it's not happening. Ensuring that practicum and field study work sites do not require background checks that involve a social security. This is really important because it's something that actually came up when I was at UC Irvine. I was a public health science major, and I had to do practicum, which is field study. It was like 100 hours for the quarter for a graduation requirement. And then when they listed the sites that were available, a lot of them actually required a background check, because especially if it's working in the hospital or clinicals, they do background check, but the background check, they require social, which I don't have. And so I was fortunate that they had other sites that were on campus that didn't require me to go through that, since I was already a student, and that's how I was able to find a site. But really thinking, because it's some overlaps that a lot of educators and even departments and programs on campus don't think about, because they don't often deal with this demographic of students. Avoiding inviting ICE and CBP officials to campuses for career fairs or as classroom guest speakers. This is really important because it's something that happens so subtly, especially at career fairs and even in different classrooms. I definitely had experiences on my campus where a student was in class and the professor invited, I think he was a Border Patrol official, to come talk about their experiences. And they was just, like things like that. You're not really thinking about the demographics of people who could be in your classrooms and who you're serving, and you don't understand the anxiety and fear that that would cause them. So really, really making sure that you're avoiding that altogether is important, especially again for Black undocumented students who face double criminalization. Highlighting and sharing undocumented student resources on syllabi prior to lectures. And also, like, that's a really good way to signal allyship, because you don't know who in your classroom could be undocumented. So even just even before lecture, doing a slide on like, these are some resources that you can utilize, you know, if you're undocumented, if you're whatever other identity the student may hold. But this is a good way for students to know, like, oh, at least this professor is immigrant inclusive, because there's a lot of times when students are going through personal ordeals, such as maybe a family member is for deportation and that's affecting their coursework, but they don't feel comfortable disclosing that to you because they don't know your immigrant politics. So really doing that signaling can be very, very helpful and create ease for students. Committing resources to and fundraising for mental health resources, financial aid, and scholarships. So another great way that administrators, and this is specifically those who don't work with student services, this is like for people who are educators and administrators who have higher positions and have more influencing power in decision-making on campuses. A great way to, you know, be an ally and show allyship is making sure that you're committing to the fundraising for mental health services and financial aid and scholarships for Black undocumented students. And mental health services is especially important for us, considering the unique sense of isolation we experience, knowing that we can talk to an undocumented community, and then also knowing that we can talk to our Black peers. And then knowing back home, your family member may be also influencing you to even keep it quiet because they know the reality of the criminalization of Black people in this country. So you're left completely and utterly alone with no one to talk to. And so really having mental health services is a great way to, you know, work through that identity crisis that a lot of Black undocumented students go through. Encouraging institutions to advocate for local, state, and federal policies that expands access to undocumented immigrants. This is really important because, again, any form of policies that expands our access to higher education will inevitably, you know, benefit Black undocumented students. And so we really also want to be an ally and engage in that work. You can also go beyond by also encouraging your institution to advocate for these things. Next slide. And then addressing criminalization, this is something that is very, very important. So abolishing campus police and decreasing police presence on campus to ensure the safety and well-being of students, especially Black undocumented students, is very important. Like I mentioned before, we're doubly criminalized, higher risk of detention and deportation. And so really having no police presence on campus is the best way to ensure for our safety and well-being, and also knowing that we don't have to worry about policing ourselves on top of already being policed by the state, and also, you know, focus on our academic studies. Conducting mandatory anti-Blackness trainings for all professional staff and prospective students, and include Black undocumented voices in those trainings. This is especially important because we all participate in anti-Blackness, we are all anti-Black, and those biases and blind spots play out in how you engage with Black students. So imagine if your biases are showing when you're engaging with a Black student, how is that going to play out for Black and undocumented students? Then they have even higher risk associated with not disclosing their status because they know that, you know, your racial biases or somebody who's not willing to listen to them. So really unpacking that is important, and really thinking about how is it that I engage with Black students that's different than non-Black students, because there is a disparity there. Ensuring undocumented and Black student services have representatives in communication with campus police. And I really want to highlight this, especially because of the risk associated with Black undocumented students getting arrested, because that leads to the arrest to deportation pipeline, which is how we are 2 times more likely to be detained and deported. So making sure that a representative from undocumented student services and Black student services is in communication with PD and letting them know, like, hey, if you ever encounter any undocumented students, this is the best way to handle the situation or de-escalate the situation, and avoiding arrest altogether, because the risk associated with deportation is high for Black undocumented students. Holding campus police accountable through a committee of campus partners representing marginalized student population. So until, again, campus police is abolished and police presence on campus is decreased, how do we also hold them accountable? Because there have been so many encounters, even when I was a student on my campus, of Black students being harassed by police when it was completely unjustified because, again, of anti-Blackness. These subconscious biases that we have. And so how can we create a committee that prioritizes Black, queer, disabled, and undocumented students, and making sure that their voices are centered whenever we have these incidents happening on campus. Next slide. And last but not least, building postgraduate support. So this is very important, especially when thinking about non-DACA students, which a lot of them tend to be, Black and undocumented. So providing free LSAT, MCAT, GRE review services and resources for undocumented students. Again, especially if you don't have DACA, and a lot of these coursework can be very expensive and pricey. So literally creating that as an opportunity for students to be able to pursue their graduate studies is very beneficial. Establishing an alumni network for undocumented students that includes a mentorship program, especially just knowing the unique sense of isolation Black undocumented students experience. Imagine having an alumni network where you're connecting, an alumni who's graduated and a current undocumented Black students, and really knowing that, oh my God, you graduated, you made it through. You made it through and out of higher ed. So this is something that I can do. And you're surviving post-grad, like what does this look like? And also making sure that, you're compensating those alumni, because that is also labor. Creating and allocating financial assistance, such as stipends and grants that prioritize non-DACA Black graduates. So again, this is really important because, again, for Black undocumented students, we're most likely to not have DACA or not qualify or be eligible for DACA. And so it's harder for us to imagine life after graduation. It's interesting because a lot of us actually look into how can we continue our studies so we can just stay in school and not have to face the real world, because it's just, that harsh, especially if we don't have a social security. So how can institutions, create programs that provide stipends that help ease the transition into the real world for non-DACA students, especially. Next slide. And so now we'll go into some of the resources that you can utilize to better learn about this population. Next slide. So the first one is the guide, which is officially on our website. If you go to that specific link, and again, this presentation will be shared, but also if you just search effectively supporting Black undocumented students through higher education, that's probably the first thing that will pop up, and really encouraging what are ways that you can utilize this. So making sure to send to your campus or organization partners, leaders, and administration. And so especially if you're somebody from your organization or campus and you're the only representative here, we're asking you and pleading with you to please be that representative who goes back and relays this to all your other administrators and educators on campus, because this is something that they should all be aware about. Incorporated within your undocumented ally training. So if your spaces do have undocumented ally trainings, making sure that now you're incorporating the undocumented Black student perspective, especially because we know that is something that's probably already missing within those trainings. So now that this guide is out there and available, you can reference it to know what to include and what to highlight. Implement it into your task force work. Use it when planning your program or centers, organizations, online content and events. So again, if you don't know how to better, or you don't have any Black and undocumented students within your space who are comfortable disclosing that, because they do probably exist on your campus, even if it's 1 or 2 people, they exist, but they just may not be comfortable disclosing that. And so this is a great way to utilize or get into the mind of what is the experiences of Black and undocumented students look like. Next slide. And then these are some Black immigrant organizations that we highly encourage you to follow, especially if you're in Undocumented Students Center or a Black Resource Center. Again, one of the things we mentioned is how can you create that inclusivity for Black undocumented students? And really what you highlight on your social media is something that can signal allyship towards that population. So really making sure, and again, these are also on the guide, but making sure if you don't already follow these organizations, you follow them and really keep up with the work that they're doing, and also incorporate that into your programming for your school year. Next slide. Also, these are some videos that specifically talk about, what does it mean to be Black and undocumented. And I do also want to highlight, I have a video in here, the one on the very right, Immigrant Voices of America. And that talks more about my experience, not only being a Black undocumented student, but specifically a Black undocumented student without DACA, and navigating that process and what that looked like on my campus in terms of creating fellowships and, creating opportunities for non-DACA students. students. So if we want to learn more about, specifically what does a day in the life for Black undocumented student look like, then I really encourage you to check out that video as well. Next slide. These are also great presentations. A lot of the things that we referenced, especially in the beginning of this presentation, were from these resources. So shout out to Baji. But we really encourage you to, if you had no prior knowledge, this is your first time learning about Black undocumented students or just Black undocumented immigrants in general, then please consider looking at these reports and learning more about what is happening to Black migrants, because there's a lot of things happening right now, especially at the border. And I know our demographic is more concentrated on undocumented students, so people who are already undocumented within the country. But again, another reason that, again, you don't see a lot of us in higher education is because we're incarcerated in immigration detention at higher rates. So that connection is also really important to make. Next slide. And now, perfect. We have time for questions. I did not think that we were actually able to have time for questions, but I will open it up for questions now. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shirleen and Eva, for just presenting all of this to us today, right? There's lots of different background information, best practices, experiences that both of you shared with us today. And so again, want to thank you all for just leading us in this great conversation, or even this presentation today, right? I think we need to have more conversations following this, but everything that you both shared is included in the guide, right? So I think this is really just a first step for folks to think about. If you're not already, how are you engaging with Black undocumented students on your campus? As both of you mentioned, right? Black undocumented students are super underrepresented in higher education, but overrepresented in like detention centers. And so how can we create those pathways where Black undocumented students, right, are being led towards our colleges and universities? And once they do get there, that they're being retained to, right? I especially like the slide around addressing criminalization, because even once these students do make it to our institutions, right, it may not always be a safe space for them, considering interactions with campus police and everything like that. And so thank you both for all that you shared today. And I know there's also lots of different gratitudes and everything like that also being shared in the chat. And I think we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A too that I'll take a look at. One of them is, do you all have, can you all share some of your favorite Undocu Black artists, if any, that you want to highlight?
There's actually the guide. Actually, we do highlight some Undocu Black leaders, and two of them are artists. I forget, I think Khalif is his name, and he's actually an award-winning Grammy artist. And I think the other one, I forget, but Bamba John, who's also another undocumented, who's vocal about his status and is in limelight. So those are two that I can think of. I know there's not a lot of us who are very open about that, so.
Thank you. Yes. So the guide, again, also has more resources on videos, readings, organizations to follow and everything too, especially if you're still trying to find out like where to start, right, or how to improve your own knowledge. I think that's a good starting point for all of this as well. The guide can help support some of that too. And then I'm not sure if you both have an answer to this question, but there is a question around if there's any media toolkits on best practices on outreaching to Black undocumented students, including messaging, themes, or terms, etc.
So yeah, that's part of the problem. There are not a lot of resources out there that are connected to Black undocumented students. So I don't know of a specific major toolkit, but definitely go through the guide, because there are a lot of great resources and recommendations and tips that will let you know best practices, best way to outreach to that community.
And I think I would just add, utilizing a lot of Spanish in your outreach, because that's something that's just we do by default, because that's the majority of the undocumented population. And also, again, showing people who look like us. So it's like little cartoon art or like animations, also making them brown and Black. So we know that this is an inclusive space. And I think really the best way is, again, social media targeting Black immigrant organization and showing Black undocumented leaders in what they do, because that will create that sense of like, okay, they care about this population.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that too. And I'm also curious, right, there's a lot of best practices, lots of information you all gave to folks today. Any like, if somebody is just kind of starting out in this support, or this wasn't, wasn't a lot of, there hasn't been a lot of efforts on their campus or organization, do you have kind of like, like what's the first step that folks can take in kind of building this support for Black undocumented students, either on their campus or organization?
I think it's about intentionality. And I think that looks like finding funding. And again, this is why I highlight cross-departmental support, because if you can afford to bring out a undocumented Black speaker, then connect to the Black Resource Center or another space on your campus to create that funding to bring somebody. So if there's nobody on campus already that exists that's comfortable doing that, you have to bring people that look like them and be, what is the word? Intentional, and also don't waver just because you don't see Black undocumented students coming out. Like, be intentional about consistency. That's the word I'm looking for. Be consistent in your event planning. So if it's at least one event per quarter targeting this population, because with time, eventually they'll feel comfortable because their identity is being normalized in these spaces. And then they will also be able to come out and talk about the experiences. And then we wouldn't have to bring other speakers on campus to talk about these things. So I think if there's nobody, you have to just bring people who, like Eva and I, were at least comfortable talking about this. And the more we normalize it, the more they will come out of the woodworks as well. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. And I also would like to add that representation is important. So again, reaching out to the African student program on your campus and the Black student program, reaching out to them to create to have that aspect of representation. And it just makes people more comfortable. They're curious when they see somebody that looks like them. And a simple example, sometimes when you hear somebody that speaks your first language, for example, you're interested, or that has the same accent as you, you're like, oh, where is that person coming from? So creating that representation is gonna make undocumented students feel more comfortable. And also in your outreach emails, make sure to show inclusivity in those emails when you're trying to send resources to the undocumented population in general. Make sure that it shows that Black undocumented students are also welcome and those resources are also for them.
And I'll just add like one, I think, good example of this, which my campus did. We have cultural graduation. So we had an Undocu grad and a Black grad, and the Dream Center would advertise the Latinx graduation through their newsletter. So sign up for, Nuestra grad, I think that's what it's called. Sign up for Nuestra grad, but they never advertised Black grad. So I think this automatic assumption that, oh, we don't have Black undocumented people in these spaces needs to really be debunked and unpacked, because even if it's one or two, they benefit from seeing that. So really just intentionality, so.
Great. Yeah, great point too, right? I think we obviously will not always see like the immediate like inflow of Black undocumented students, right? Just from the start of the work, right? But I think both your points around consistency and being intentional with this work and building towards it so that the reputation and that pathways and things like that are built is a really big step forward, considering, right, this is sometimes like, this is probably one of the first resources around engaging Black undocumented students, right? And so how do we kind of build towards that work so that more of this and more resources exist for Black undocumented students specifically in our institutions? And so I know that we have a couple more questions left. We will share Eva and Shirleen's contact information before we close the webinar today. And I know Nancy from Immigrants Rising has also been putting an evaluation in the slides. So we're going to start wrapping up, and I'm going to leave it both to Shirleen and Eva to maybe share any final remarks with our audience today, and then just a final call out. Please let us know how this webinar went for you all, how this can support your work, what other kind of resources would you like to see. Fill out this short evaluation form that we have. And then I'll also just have us display. If we did not get a chance to go through your question today, please reach out to myself or two amazing authors and presenters today for other questions. And I'll leave it both to you to give any final remarks to our audience today.
Yeah, thank you all for showing up and coming to this webinar. I know talking about Black undocumented immigrants is not the most popular conversation just because of how marginalized and underseen this population is. But I just hope that, especially if you're like one of the few people from your campuses who are here, I just really encourage you to be that representative for us and help us spread this guide to your campuses. Because I guarantee you they are, even if it's one or two undocumented Black students who exist in your spaces, and they need this. They probably don't know about this guy. They may not know about it for a very long time. So really asking you to be agents who help spread this guide and make sure it's being utilized.
Yeah, and I wanted to finish by thanking the students that were part of creating this guide, that took the time and participating in the focus groups, answer the questions, help us have all those findings. And also thank you to the educators that were part of our educators focus groups. If this guide is out, it's also partly thanks to you and your collaboration. So thank you all. And I encourage everybody to show such intentionality by taking part in events like this, in webinars like this, answering invitations from undocumented students, creating programs for them, because we don't have a lot of resources out there. So that's the important part. And really, I want to thank you all for showing up today and for being part of this moment. And I hope you're going to continue sharing and continue being an ally. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. I know we hit our 2 o'clock hour. Again, this is just the beginning, I think, of these efforts. Learn from this guide, learn from this webinar, right? Share it with your campus and community partners. And let's really make sure that we're uplifting Black undocumented narratives and we're building those support systems that's really needed for them on our campuses. And great appreciations for both Eva and Shirleen for sharing this presentation and this guide with us today. They are also amazing speakers, as you saw, who love to speak at other campus colleges. And so please reach out to them as well. Their contact information is available on the slide. Thank you all today, and we hope to connect with each one of you soon. And let us know if there's any feedback and everything like that that you have on the guide. And don't forget to fill out our evaluation as well too, to see what kind of resources we can provide to continue to support your work. Oh, I think we can end it, Tony, if